Hi, and welcome to the Global Hope Show. Today we have a special guest, Mr. Bruce Rich. I'll let him introduce himself, but let's find out who else is going to be on the panel.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim Good. Been here in Hawaii for the last 30 years or so, and owner of a small construction company that's hit the skids along with every other construction company here on the island.
Hi, I'm Shauna Gordon. I'm a agriculture major at Hawaii Community College and a sociology student. And next we have
Khalil Ditej. I'm taking accounting, and I've been on the island since '03, doing business, selling coffee, and farming, and yes, broadening my education.
Well, I'm Bruce Rich. I live in Washington, D.C. I'm a lawyer who's worked in the nonprofit environmental area for nearly 30 years, trying to promote environmental and social standards for international finance. And I'm here as a guest speaker to talk about my book called To Uphold the World, A Call for a New Global Ethic from Ancient India, which is basically an historical and philosophical reflection on the theme that a global economy requires a global ethic.
My name is Matt McNall, and I'm a philosophy student here at UHH, and doing my best to contribute to the world in some way.
I'm Dan DuPont, a computer science major here at UH. I'm an international activist. I consider myself the unflinching eye of the internet.
And Corey Harden, a community member, and have a background in human services and also in environmental protection for this island.
All right. Well, we had Bruce talking earlier, giving a discussion, and we'd like to continue that discussion with any questions that anybody has. So, open it up to anyone,
really. I came late to the talk also, but Bruce's subject touched on the role of government in the economy, and the other day I was listening to the Amy Goodman Democracy Now! The War and Peace report, and she had a clip, I'm pretty sure it was Timothy Geithner, and he started off his speech by saying the role of the government is to smooth the way for business to succeed. And no one, he said, wait a minute, who's defining government in those terms? But Geithner did, and I was quite surprised that was his definition of the major role of government. So I thought we could use that as an opening comment.
Why I was quite astounded when you mentioned that, because it reminds me that our political discourse in the United States has been in fast reverse for years now, and it seems like we've heard that before, like under the administration of Calvin Coolidge 60 or 70 years ago, who said the business of America is America. And so it's quite astounding that someone who's a Treasury Secretary in a Democratic administration would say something like that. Of course, one role of the government is to facilitate the economy and business and so on. But that completely ignores the critical role of the government to ensure a basic social framework for its citizens, a framework of health and education and justice. And along the lines of my talk, I mentioned that the founder of modern economics, who's often cited even by the right wing, starting with Ronald Reagan and so on, Adam Smith in the 18th century, who we remember as the economist who wrote The Wealth of Nations, which promoted the idea of unleashing markets and free trade against a protectionist crony capitalism and so on. Even Adam Smith wrote, in the other great book that he wrote, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he wrote that society is upheld by three values that the government has to support. Justice, which he defines as protecting the weak against the strong, including the economically weak against the strong. Two, what he calls prudence, which is the combination individually and collectively through the government to foresee the long-term consequences of certain actions, and then take actions over the short term to avoid those consequences or favor them. And then thirdly, beneficence, which is compassion, social welfare, and so on. And so Smith never stood for the principle that the purpose of human society was purely business or free markets. On the contrary, he said that if you don't have a government supporting through, presumably through regulation and governments and law and money, these social values of justice and prudence would be regulation, and beneficence would be the social welfare programs we think of, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, and so on. He says that all of society falls apart. So that's astounding that even our Secretary of the Treasury probably was citing a proposition so extreme that not even the founder of free market theory, Adam Smith, would support.
Well, I think one of the supporters that is actively cited for the way economic has developed in America is Ayn Rand with her thesis of objectivism. The way it metastasized through Alan Greenspan and then found its way into the American economic system. Do you have any comments on that type of Alan Greenspan's contributions type of thing to the current economic system as to how it developed?
Let's repeat his comments, because after the financial crisis in 2008, I think it was late in the autumn of 2008, there was a hearing in the Senate, and Greenspan got up, and he actually issued a mea culpa, which is quite extraordinary. I mention it in my book because he said, he said that he himself was shaken, and that he admitted that the intellectual assumptions on which he had been operating, which many of his fellow economists and policymakers were operating, were erroneous, that they had made really big mistakes. And he said something to the effect that the problem was that they were just relying on historical data that was only a decade or two old, which is kind of astounded me because we had something called the Great Depression where similar things happened and so on. So Greenspan actually has admitted publicly that the whole intellectual world that he was operating on, which is let the market do its magic, deregulation, and markets are kind of self-correcting, and that businesses, for example, and particularly large Wall Street firms, would not do things that would be against their longer-term self-interest that would lead to the economic crisis or disintegration. That he was quite wrong. He said economic actors in the short term will be so greedy and so short-sighted that they'll undertake actions that could even bring the whole capitalist system to collapse, which is precisely, of course, what happened in the 30s. And as we recall, it was Franklin Roosevelt who saved capitalism from itself with massive government intervention and regulation. And I have to recall some of the words that Roosevelt said, because today we hear statements about we shouldn't criticize our captains of industry in Wall Street and so on. Well, Roosevelt, though he came from a very privileged background, he made statements that today would be considered left-wing, incendiary, revolutionary. He condemned on national radio, speaking as the President of the United States, what he called, quote, the malefactors of great wealth, end quote, who were fighting against his program. So he specifically targeted Wall Street and the rich, and he said, they hate me, and he said, quote, I welcome their hatred. And they have an American president, taking on Wall Street and referring to people of great wealth as malefactors, almost as criminals, and saying they hate me and I welcome their hatred. This was Franklin Roosevelt, who we all agree is one of the greatest presidents in the history of the United States. So I think our political discourse today has slowly become almost castrated, eviscerated from reality and calling things what they are. At the same time, paradoxically, it's become polarized around idiotic cliches and misrepresentations, whether particularly on the right from the Fox News and so on. So I think looking back just a little bit in American history at economic crises in the past, how our government responded, how the American people responded, and the fact it's not a surprise that people who own great wealth, in some cases, some of them can be liberals, but others can be, frankly, can be up to actions that are undermining our democracy. And so things have to be called for what they are. Franklin Roosevelt did that.
I wonder what you think about how the military interacts with the economy. In Hawaii, the military is seen as one of the pillars of the economy.
Yeah.
And they say it puts a lot of money in, but a lot of money goes out too. So I'd like your comments on that.
Well, it's an interesting question of how much money the U.S. government should be spending on the military. Many people have raised the issue of why we have hundreds of military bases around the world and this kind of thing. And the Hawaii, I can understand how Hawaii perhaps is dependent significantly on military spending, but probably over the long term, that's not the healthiest thing in the world. It would be better to have a more diversified economy, and maybe the resources that go from the U.S. government to the military, if we were to cut our military spending, have a more modest military footprint in the world, that could go for government investments in alternative energy and research and development and so on. Of course, Hawaii would be an ideal place for scaled-up research in things such as geothermal energy and wave energy and what have you. So I think it's something to think about over the longer term.
I'm also thinking in terms of the damage they do as far as toxins and hazardous materials left on the bases and the enmity we get from people whose countries we've invaded and what we have done to the countries there.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, obviously, I think the military is supposed to carry out environmental impact assessments for a lot of their activities. There is some legal regulation concerning that.
They do.
Whether it's implemented very well or not is another question.
Yes.
But I think the other issue you raised of the enmity of countries around the world for U.S. foreign policy, I mean, that's an issue that's been around for a long time. And, we see, like, for example, in the Middle East, I mean, fortunately in the recent upheaval in Egypt, by the way, it's a great T-shirt you've got. The Egyptian people, sometimes we're too self-centered. They're actually, from all the news accounts I think we've been able to see on the major networks, they're most concerned about themselves and having a better future and a more democratic system. And it appears that there's not much enmity or dislike for the American people. In fact, in the Arab world, around the world, people admire the United States a lot still, not for our foreign policy or our governmental policies, but in spite of our foreign policy. They admire still the things in America that are unusual, relatively speaking, an atmosphere of freedom and creativity, a multi-ethnic society that's made a lot of progress over the past decades to become more open and tolerant, and a certain American inventiveness and openness to the world, in spite of our internal disputes and so on. So people do admire, and they admire the inventiveness of American business. Think of Apple Computer and that kind of thing. So that, but our foreign policy and our propensity to leave our democratic values partly behind when we go, our government, that's to say, when it goes abroad to support our short-term interests by propping up dictators around the world. This has been going on for a long time, you can say, and inevitably it always produces the expected reaction. Look at what happened in Iran after our support for the Shah, and that the problems we have in Iran are partly linked to the long-term support of the Shah, and his secret police and so on. Luckily, in Egypt, I would say, I think that situation seems to be transitioning to a one that hasn't. The army did not step in to shoot people; it remained more neutral. And I've been to Egypt, and any tourist who goes there can testify to the friendliness of the Egyptian people, and they have nothing against America. They like Americans and so on. But obviously, U.S. foreign policy and propping up dictators around the world, people don't like it.
I have a few questions, if I may digress a little bit from the previous conversation. about the monetary system. I need to seize the moment, you being here and being an economist. I am curious about the Federal Reserve, fractional reserve banking, and whether or not the privatization of our monetary system affects our society and the repercussions of that.
Yeah. Well, I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer. Though I did write a book about the World Bank, which came out about 16 years ago, which was called Mortgaging the Earth, which kind of gives you the idea of my interpretation of the World Bank. In terms of privatization, I think the Federal Reserve is not, obviously not privatized, though we have seen an emergency situation where the government stepped in during the crisis to prop up a lot of banks on Wall Street and so on. And I think most people agree that given the situation we came to, that was very necessary, though it was obviously there are numerous small business owners around the U.S. that can't get loans to be bailed out as their businesses failed, while the American International Group and Goldman Sachs and the various Bank of America and talking about malefactors of great wealth, these are institutions that whose recklessness drove us to this financial crisis, and then they're bailed out. So I think it is true that the government has bailed out the richest entities in our society and some of the richest people in the United States on Wall Street and the banking sector. But I think there's another issue about privatization, because that's of the economy, because that's been a trend that's been going on around the world for the past 20 years, and it's been promoted by the U.S. Treasury Department, by certain elements of the economics profession, and it's been promoted through the policies of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. That's to say, the idea that as much as the economy as possible should be deregulated and privatized, including basic health services, basic utilities, and so on. And the World Bank and things like water utilities and so on. And this is a very controversial area. In many developing countries, for example, the World Bank and the IMF have been promoting these policies. And the theory, of course, is that, well, when the government runs things, it's inefficient and wastes money and so on. So if you can put these things in the hands of the private sector, it'll be efficient and everything, so everyone benefits. I mean, that's the theory. So the economists say, so on a certain abstract theoretical level, many of these policies sound reasonable if you accept assumptions that are actually disconnected from real life and real experience. Because what we see with the privatization of many basic services is that in some cases the private sector is much more inefficient. Let's take the healthcare sector. I don't know how many of you, what your personal experiences are in dealing with our privatized health system. Many of the largest private health insurance companies, let's take United Healthcare, which is, I think, the largest, which covers tens and tens of millions of people, quoted on the New York Stock Exchange and so on, other private health insurance companies. I think the experience of many Americans is that there are bureaucracies which are much more bureaucratic, inefficient, difficult to deal with than any government service. Just try and get reimbursed for your health care expenses and so on. And in the United States, with our mainly still private sector healthcare system, even with the Obama healthcare reform, which basically subsidizes health insurance companies in the pharmaceutical business, we're a country that spends twice as much in terms of the amount of our gross national product on healthcare. Something like 14 or 15% of our entire national economic product is spent on healthcare, and mainly going to subsidized to government empowered and enabled private health insurance companies and so on. And then we turn to Europe, these inefficient socialistic economies going down the drain like Germany or Sweden or something like that, and France. And amazingly enough, these are all countries where the proportion of the gross national product going to healthcare, it's half or 60% of the U.S. It's around 6, 7, 8%. And yet, more people are covered. You don't have a large part of the population without health insurance, and you have a higher quality of health care on the average. Now, no system is perfect. You have you have issues in the Canadian system and so on, but something is wrong. In the U.S., we somehow come through lack of planning to the worst of all possible worlds. A healthcare system which is incredibly expensive, incredibly bureaucratic, where the government is supporting significant parts of it, but yet where the coverage it has been inadequate, and then the quality of basic health services, particularly for very poor people and so on. Now, the U.S. has some social indicators like the infant mortality rate, which is an indicator of the basic level of civilization of a country. How many children are dying unnecessarily, and so. The U.S. has a higher infant mortality rate than some developing countries. I think Cuba, actually, with all its problems, I mean, Cuba may be an economic disaster in many ways, certainly, but Cuba has a lower infant mortality rate than the United States, and then any country in Western Europe, it's half that of the United States. And of course, it's also what's also scandalous about these statistics is that the high infant mortality rate, it's not among, upper middle class, successful professional people. I mean, they have we all enjoy a high standard of health care. It's among poor minorities, the poorest, more powerless people in this country. They're the ones that have these basically almost third world health indicators in some ways. So that's a national, but we have to do something about that. And so the privatization is another great example are the railroads in the UK. The railroads in the United Kingdom were privatized. According to some business school theories, there was an unpacking, an unbundling, where the tracks were sold to one set of companies, the railroad terminals were sold to another company, the trains, the engines were sold to other companies. So the UK, the first country in the world to have developed railroads, it has basically almost like a third world railroad system now, as compared to France or Germany or China now, which of course now has half of the high-speed trains in the world, which they've all built in the past 5 years.
Mr. Rich,
These are just examples of how the privatization is. If you accept the assumption, which is people sometimes naively put forth, that this will make things more efficient and so on. Well, if that were true, fine. But the fact is, just look at the real world, not the utopian economic theoretical work. You see, in practice, governments oftentimes do some things better and more efficiently than the private sector. And let's not look to theory. Let's look to other Western industrialized countries to see how that works.
all right, that is a very lucid argument, and thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
I'm
but
sorry.
we're going to be doing a...
Okay.
Oh, we're not?
Yeah, okay.
Oh,
Okay, no, we're not.
I was getting one.
Well, this gentleman had a question.
Oh, yeah, a question.
Well, I just
Sorry,
wanted to, in fact, you answered it basically, and the outcomes in many health parameters are worse here than these countries that spend way less than half that what we do on healthcare.
Yeah.
But I just wondered, kind of to change the subject, but there's kind of a new area of thought that a lot of the social problems are closely tied not to the level of our economy and our wealth, but to our inequality and our income and wealth. And I just wondered if you had started to integrate that into your way of looking at these problems and these issues.
Well, I think there are a couple of books that have come out on these themes. But was one by Derek Bok, the former president of Harvard? I can't remember. There was one. One was American, the other was published by a couple of British researchers. But the thrust of these books, these studies, were that even in very rich industrialized countries where you have a lot of economic inequality, you have all kinds of actually real medical impacts among the people in very hierarchical, unequal societies. The majority of the population feels more stressed, more depressed, and many of these things translate actually into things like high blood pressure, somewhat higher rates of heart attacks, strokes, perhaps weakened immune systems, and so on. And it basically linked to basic levels of social stress. And of course, studies are made about people who, in jobs where they don't feel they have much control, they have very little control over their environment and a lot of pressure on them, and they're not well paid. Naturally, people in jobs like that feel very stressed, and you take several thousand of them, and obviously their health indicators will probably be worse than people in less stressful, better paid jobs, and so on. So there's a question about what the economy is for. You know, what is all this growth for, and so on, and sometimes we've been so obsessed with means, with the economy, we've forgotten what it's supposed to be for. And of course, most people would concede, whether from the right or from the left, well, the economy is here to expand human possibilities, freedom, and human happiness. And then, but there are other concerns. It's a country where at the same level of gross national product, where the money is better distributed, and where people as a whole feel better about themselves, where you don't have a few people at the top who feel like they're masters in the universe, and everyone else feels increasing economic insecurity and stress, then it's just common sense that the more equal societies would be, everything else being equal, would be happier societies, and probably the state of mental and physical health on the whole would be better too.
If I may go back a little bit and kind of redirect my question, when I said privatization of economies,
Yeah.
I was definitely referring to some of your experience with the World Bank,
Yeah.
and I was curious what you think about how the World Bank goes in and basically forces countries into debt,
Yeah.
and then takes control, privatizes their economies through that debt control.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was kind of referring to, because they've moved a little bit away from that because the reactions have been so controversial. But in the 90s, through a good part of this past decade, and this was this was almost a semi-conventional wisdom. The U.S. Treasury Department was pushing this. These international financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, and the similar institutions were pushing it. And I would say even certain governments in Europe, their finance ministries, which tend to be more conservative, which have the same schools of economic thought, would push this in part too. Of course, the bank would claim that it doesn't force anyone to do anything, but you have many poor developing countries where the only place they can borrow money from is the World Bank and the IMF, and then there are conditions applied to those loans which which have required privatization of major services, opening the domestic markets up to free trade, while the rich industrialized countries like the U.S., Japan, Europe, still protect their markets to a considerable extent. I'll give you one example, which is Haiti, because under the Bill Clinton's administration, he pushed, of course Haiti is a totally powerless country, he pushed for Haiti to open its agricultural production and industry up to free trade. And up to, even up through the Clinton administration, Haiti was though not entirely self-sufficient in food, certainly, it produced a lot more of its own rice, for example. And under Bill Clinton, he pushed trade agreements with Haiti, of course, a totally powerless country, where Haiti eliminated all its tariffs and subsidies for its protective tariffs for its own domestic rice production. And then what happened is U.S. rice production, which is heavily subsidized through the Agriculture Department, Haiti doesn't have the money to subsidize it, they didn't have protected, flooded Haiti with U.S. rice, and the entire domestic rice production in Haiti totally collapsed. So they had to import all of its food. Clinton recently, last May, he apologized to he said this was a terrible mistake. Free trade was good for American rice farmers in Arkansas because they're subsidized, but he thought it ended up to be a disaster for Haiti.
So on that note, we actually are out of time currently. So we're going to hopefully continue the discussion on the next show. So tune in again for more Bruce Rich and the Global Hope Show. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm coming back.